In our lesson today, we're continuing our series on the book of James, where we're looking at, throughout this letter, what the life of a Christian looks like. James describes to us in very practical terms what faith looks like in our everyday lives. And here in this lesson, we're going to be looking at the first part of chapter 4, where James describes the need to submit to God and at the same time resist the devil. So as we go through this passage here in James chapter 4, let's look and see what lessons we can learn from this that we need to take and apply to our lives today as Christians. First, he begins by talking about this conflict that we are involved in, that is within us and surrounding us. In James chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, he says, "What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members? You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. You are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasures. You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you think the Scripture speaks to no purpose? He jealously desires a spirit which he has made to dwell in us." So as he begins this section here, he's talking about this conflict that we are involved in as part of a larger conflict between good and evil, between God and the devil. But it's also manifested in the conflicts that can arise among our own brethren. And these conflicts that arise with one another, he explains that these are rooted in selfishness. What is the source of these quarrels? He says, it's your pleasures that wage war in your members. We put our desires and our lusts, what we want, over the good of others. We make that as being more important than what others need or others want or what is good for them. That causes conflict and strife, ultimately division. He explains there in these verses that if we follow after our own lusts, not only does it lead to sin in our life directly, as he would talk about in chapter 1, we've already studied that earlier in this series, but in our relationships with one another, when we follow after our lusts, it leads to conflict with our brethren. We murder and we fight and we quarrel. He uses a little bit of hyperbole here, but he's making the point that we are willing to do all of these things because we want to satisfy our own pleasures, what we want, pursuing our own lusts and satisfying what we desire. So he's using very strong language here. And then he continues this strong language where he calls them you adulteresses in verse 4. And he explains that the reason why he's calling them that, they as Christians have made a commitment to be faithful to God. But they're not being faithful to God. Because he says you've become a friend of the world. Friendship with the world, he said, is hostility toward God. We might think of the conflict or the two sides as being God on one hand, we are to submit to him, and on the other hand you have the devil. And obviously we're not to follow what the devil says, but in the middle, kind of neutral, is the world. But James says here we're not to view it that way. We have God and his ways and what we have our hope in him, and then we have the things of this world, which is rooted in our pleasures, our lusts, our desires, and all of those things. These things are only temporary. These things that are not what our hope is. But we put those things as being more important than other things. He says, you make yourself a friend of the world, then you make yourself an enemy of God. We have to choose which side we're going to be on. It's not just, well, either God or Satan. Do we want to be a friend of God or do we want to be a friend of the world? Those are the two choices. We can't choose both. And God wants us to choose him. He said in verse 5 that he jealously desires us to do this. He wants us to be on his side. But we have to make that choice. He's not going to force us to do this. He's not going to override our free will. But we have to make this choice. So we have to understand there is this conflict, this larger conflict between good and evil. And it is demonstrated or manifested in each of our lives, in the relationships that we have with others, in the interactions we have with them, how we can be at odds with them. We can have division, we can have strife because we're not submitting to God and following him. Instead, we're pursuing our own desires and our own lusts. And so we're willing to do wrong to others, be at odds with one another in order to satisfy what we desire. We have to choose. Are we going to be a friend of God, or are we going to be a friend of the world and value the things that are of this life? We have to make that choice. So then as James goes on, he talks about the need for us to submit to God in verses 6 through 10 here in chapter 4. It says, "But he gives a greater grace. Therefore it says, God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be miserable and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves in the presence of the Lord, and he will exalt you." He talks about that resisting the devil, and we'll get to that here in just a minute. But here in this part, what we're going to emphasize here is what he says about submitting to God. And notice how strong of language he's been using here, how important this is. This is not something to overlook. We've already seen him call these brethren adulteresses for choosing to be a friend of the world. And now he's telling them, you cleanse your hands, you sinners, purify your hearts, you double-minded. He's wanting them to wake up. He's wanting them to pay attention to what he is saying. So he's telling them there, you need to submit to God. Submitting to God means putting his will ahead of our own. That we are making a commitment that we are going to do what he wants us to do in all things, not just in part of our life. Again, we can't ride the fence. We can't say, well, I'm going to be a friend of God and a friend of the world. We have to be completely committed to him, to the Lord. Be committed to doing his will in all things. Why should we do this? Because he said there in verse 6 that he gives a greater grace. God is opposed to the proud. He gives grace to the humble. We need his grace. We need to be humble enough to submit to him, to follow him, because we're in need of the grace that he offers. That grace is necessary for our salvation. We cannot be saved without it. We are saved by grace through faith, as he said in Ephesians 2 and verse 8. Without his grace, we are lost. We have no hope. So why do we submit to God? It's because we want to be saved. We want to receive his grace. How do we submit to him? What does that look like? Again, in practical terms, what does it look like? It's not just some abstract thought that, well, I'm going to believe in God and understand who he is and recognize what Jesus did in dying on the cross for me. What do we do in submitting to God? He said, cleanse your hands, you sinners. We cleanse our hands by giving up sin. We crucify the old self, as Romans 6 talks about in verse 6. We are raised to walk in newness of life. We consider ourselves dead to sin, but alive to God, as in Romans 6 and verse 11. We have to give up sin. We cannot continue in sin. Then he talks about purifying our hearts. And we might think of this in the same way as cleansing our hands, that we give up sin, we become pure. But he's using it in a little bit slightly different term. Yes, it is related. We can talk about purifying ourselves by giving up sin. But he said, purify your hearts, you double-minded. That he's describing ones who, if they're not purified in heart, then they are double-minded. They're not focused fully and completely on the things of God. He's talking about ridding everything out of your heart that is distracting you from serving God. That we are to be fully and completely focused on Him and committed to Him and doing His will. That we are following His ways and His wisdom. He talks about this term double-minded in the context of praying and asking for wisdom in chapter 1. This is being singly focused on following Him and doing His will. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7, walking by faith and not by sight. We've given ourselves wholly over to Him. We're fully focused on that. We are to mourn over our sin. That this mourning, that we recognize that we have sinned. Godly sorrow leads to repentance, as 2 Corinthians 7 talks about. We have to be willing to recognize the terribleness of sin. That sin is what separates us from God. And when we sin, we have violated the law of God. We've not been faithful to Him. We've fallen short of what He wants us to do and to be. And that's not something we want. It's something that we mourn over. We want to correct that. Part of submitting to God is recognizing how awful sin is and then working to put sin away from our life. He said there, if we submit to God, if we humble ourselves before Him, He will exalt us. Whereas Peter said in 1 Peter 5 and verse 6, very similar, but Peter adds, He will exalt us at the proper time. This is not about, as he talked about at the beginning of this chapter, where we have conflicts with one another, we are warring with one another, quarrels and all of those things. And those are rooted in our lust and our selfishness, which is related to that, the idea that we want to be elevated above others. It's an attitude of arrogance, really. And what Peter and James in this passage are saying is that if we submit to God, we humble ourselves before Him, He will exalt us, and He will do it at the proper time. When He returns to save those who have been faithful to Him, we will be exalted. We will be with Him for eternity. We will be separated from those who are not following Him. And we will be rewarded with a home in heaven with Him. We don't need to exalt ourselves. We don't need to try to lift ourselves up and elevate ourselves above others to make ourselves look more important than others and try to win these battles and quarrels and conflicts that exist. We don't need to do that. We submit to God. We humble ourselves before Him, and He will exalt us at the proper time. Now, along with doing this, we are to resist the devil. That's in the same passage that we read. In verse 7, it says, submit therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. This is necessary for us to do if we're going to submit to God. There is no middle ground. We can't say, well, I'm going to follow God, I'm going to submit to Him, but also in this part of my life here, I'm going to follow what I want to do, which really means I'm going to follow what the devil wants me to do. The devil wants us to reject God and not submit to Him. We can't say, well, I'm going to give some of my life over to that, but then this other part of my life, the rest of my life, I'm going to submit to God. There's no middle ground. We have to make the choice, submit to God and resist the devil, or we give in to the devil and we depart from God. But he says, by saying this, resist the devil, he's giving us the assurance and the encouragement that we can resist the devil. We are never going to be in a situation where no matter what we choose, no matter what options are before us, that we just have no other choice but to give in to what Satan wants us to do. We will never be in a situation where we have to sin. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13 says that God is faithful and He will provide a way of escape every time we're tempted. No matter what situation we're in, no matter what temptation we face, there is always the option to do what is right. But it's up to us to be willing to humble ourselves and submit to God and then resist the devil. Well, how do we resist the devil? Well, if we remember what we said about how we submit to God, all of those things are go into this idea of resisting the devil because they go necessarily together. They're all one and the same thing. We submit to God, we resist the devil. How do we resist the devil? Well, we resist the temptation to think too highly of ourselves. We have to humble ourselves before God. And so we have to fight against arrogance and pride. Pride goes before destruction, as Proverbs 16 verse 18 says. That if we don't want to be on the path that leads to destruction, we need to humble ourselves before God and resist this urge to elevate ourselves, to be puffed up with pride, and do what we want to do and disregard God and others. Resist that temptation. We need to look for and take the way of escape when we're tempted. Again, we're never going to find ourselves in a situation where everything we might do would be sinful and wrong. There's always an option to do what is right. It may not be pleasant, may not be what we want to do, but there is always an option before us to do what is right. So we need to look for and take that way of escape because God is faithful. He's promised it will be there. We need to focus on the things of God and ignore the distractions of this world. Colossians 3 verses 1 and 2 talks about how we need to set our mind on things above and not on things that are on the earth. Again, this goes back to the idea of being a friend of God or being a friend of the world. What are we going to focus on? What are we going to pursue? Is it going to be the things of God, or will it be the things of this world? Now, there are some things in this world, responsibilities that we have to give attention to, but what is our purpose and our focus, our primary focus? We cannot allow this world to distract us from following after God. And even the things of this life that are necessary, the responsibilities that we have to fulfill, even those, don't let those distract you from what is most important in serving God. And in resisting the devil, we are not to celebrate or tolerate or excuse sin as our society does, as the world around us does. Isaiah 5 and verse 20 talks about those who call evil good and good evil. There's a lot of that in the world around us. People who call evil good. Well, resisting the devil means we're not going to go along with that. If it's evil, it's evil. If it's good, it's good. We're not going to change the definitions of it. We're not going to adopt the thinking and the language of the world around us. If it's evil, we cannot call it good. We cannot compromise on that. But we have to recognize what is right and what is wrong and stick to that. By doing that, we are resisting the devil. So then in the last couple of verses of this section here, verses 11 and 12, he says, "Do not speak against one another, brethren. He who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge of it. There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you who judge your neighbor?" So he began this section here in chapter 4, beginning in verse 1, talking about the conflicts that exist among brethren that are rooted under a larger conflict between good and evil, between God and the devil. But in that, one of the ways that this is seen is in the conflicts that exist among brethren. And so he comes back to that point here. He talks about, as we submit to God, we resist the devil. We are not to speak evil of our brethren. We are not to be at odds with them. Don't speak evil of them, but that does not mean we don't recognize when they're in sin and try to turn them back. He would say at the end of this letter in chapter 5, verses 19 and 20, how we are to take advantage of those opportunities when we see a brother in sin to turn them back to the truth. We have a responsibility to do that, to try to help someone see where they are wrong and bring them back to the Lord. That's not what he's talking about here, though. He's talking about speaking evil of our brethren. And at the same time, he's saying you're speaking against the law. So this is not about recognizing someone's in sin and trying to help turn them back. This is about condemning someone based on some standard that is different from the law. That you have a standard that is not the law of God. And so you're speaking against the law because you have some other standard. You have some other law or opinion or whatever it might be that you are holding people up to. You're judging them based upon that. And you're condemning them because they don't live up to it. Whether it's your opinions or some rules that someone else made that are not in God's word, it's not His will. But you hold people up to that standard and they don't live up to it, so you condemn them for it. You speak evil against them because of that. Because what you're doing is you're speaking against the law. You're judging the law. You're judging God's law as being insufficient because God's law didn't say those things. God's law didn't condemn them, but you are condemning them now based upon a human standard. James says you cannot do that. There's only one lawgiver and judge, and that's God. God is the one lawgiver. God is the judge, and our eternal fate is in His hands, not in anyone else, and no one else's fate is in our hands. Everyone's fate is in God's hands. He is the judge. He is the one who has given the law. So it is not our place to judge others. Romans 14 and verse 4, Paul asks, well, who are you to judge the servant of another? Well, that's not our place. Yes, we can try to help someone and correct them and encourage them, but it's not our place to judge others based upon some human standard, based upon our opinions. Instead, what we need to do, recognizing that there's one lawgiver and one judge, and we are going to stand before Him, we need to make sure that we are right with the Lord. And once we focus on that first, once we make sure we are right with the Lord, then we're in a position to encourage others to do the same. We're not in hostility against God as being a friend of the world, as he talked about earlier in this passage. And so we are condemned, and so we're condemning others and quarreling and fighting amongst one another. No, we don't need to be in that position. Instead, our focus needs to be serving God, submitting to Him, humbling ourselves before Him. And then as we do that, we're then in a position where we can help others because we're going to be approaching it the right way, from the right perspective. Humbling ourselves before God and then trying to help others along to do the same. So what does James talk about here? He explains to us that God will judge us based upon His law. He is the lawgiver. He is the judge. So we need to submit to Him in everything that we do. And in doing that, we also resist the devil. And James gives us the promise that if we resist the devil, he will flee from us. He's going to find another target. And there are plenty of other targets that he can find. There are plenty of other people who will give in to those temptations, resist the devil, and he'll go look for someone else. He will flee from us. But as we do all of these things, we can enjoy peace with one another. As we humble ourselves before God, we submit to Him, we resist the devil. We're not going to have these conflicts and quarrels and fights and divisions amongst one another. We can have peace with one another because we're all following the same standard. We all have a common goal. We're all submitting to God and humbling ourselves before Him. And by doing that, being humble with one another. So we can have peace with one another. We don't have to have the quarrels and the fights, but it begins by submitting to God and resisting the devil. So let's work on doing that. Submit to God, humble ourselves before Him, and put Him first, and not divide our allegiance, not think we can be a friend of the world, but resist the devil and humble ourselves before the Lord, always submitting to Him.